Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are lacing up, you could say, for pretty deep exploration into distance running training.
Yeah, we got quite a stack here. We're drawing from some classics like Martin Coe's Better Training for Distance Runners, but also, modern science from Steve Magnus's The Science of Running, and even looking at current trends like the Norwegian method being Brad Culp.
It's a real mix, isn't it? Old school wisdom, new science, current practices.
Absolutely. And our mission today really is to try and sift through all of that, pull out the core ideas, the main philosophies, how training is structured through phases, the actual methods, basically what goes into building that elite endurance.
It's definitely more than just logging miles. There's science, there's experience, maybe even a bit of art to it all.
For sure. It's a fascinating blend.
Okay, so where do we start? Before we even talk about training programs, maybe we should get into the engine itself. What's actually happening in the body when you run?
Good starting point. At the most basic level, you've got muscle contraction. The sources dive deep into this, talking about the sliding filament theory.
Right, the actin and myosin molecules.
Exactly. They latch onto each other, form these things called cross bridges, and, pull. That's what generates the force, makes the muscle shorten or lengthen. It's the absolute foundation.
And getting those muscles to fire, that's the brain's job, right? Neural recruitment. Magnus talks about this.
Yeah, and it's crucial for endurance. Your brain isn't just blasting all your muscle fibers constantly during a long run. It recruits motor units, that's a nerve cell, and the muscle fibers it controls sort of cyclically.
So some are working, while others get a tiny break.
Kind of, yeah. But as you pick up the pace or run harder, your brain has to recruit more of those units at the same time, and they get less downtime.
And training actually makes that communication better. Magnus has that highway analogy.
That's a great one. Training is like upgrading the roads for those nerve signals, bigger highways, higher speed limits. Your brain just gets much more efficient at telling the muscles exactly what to do, when to do it.
Makes sense. Now, muscle fibers themselves, they aren't all the same. Martin and Coe mentioned slow twitch and fast twitch, ST and FT. Magnus uses slightly different terms, SO and FG.
Slow oxidative and fast glycolytic, yeah. But they map pretty closely. The ST or SO fibers, they're your endurance specialists. Packed with mitochondria, great at using oxygen for fuel, built for the long haul.
Okay, so they're the marathon fibers. What about the fast twitch, the FG ones? Are they just for sprinting?
Not entirely, especially the type TIA fast twitch fibers. They're powerful, yes, but they also have some aerobic capability. They're really important for faster paces within a distance run, for surges, for kicking at the end.
And training can influence them. Can you turn fast fibers into slow ones?
Well, the science is a bit debated on a full conversion in humans, though some animal studies suggest it's possible with chronic stimulation. But what's definitely accepted is that training changes the characteristics of those fast twitch fibers. You can make them more fatigue resistant, more efficient. Magnus argues that the best runners usually have a good blend, and training helps optimize that balance for whatever your event is.
So it's not just about having the right fibers, but also using them efficiently. Biomechanics. Elastic energy sounds important here.
Yeah.
Magnus talks about the stretch shortening cycle.
The SSC, yeah. Think of it like a spring or a rubber band. When a muscle, or crucially a tendon, gets stretched quickly right before it contracts, it snaps back with more force.
Like loading a spring.
Exactly. Your Achilles tendon, the arch of your foot, they're amazing at this. They store energy when you land and return it as you push off. It makes running much more efficient than just purely muscular effort.
Does foot strike play into that then?
Yeah.
Heel versus midfoot or forefoot?
It can, yeah. Magnus suggests that landing more towards the midfoot or forefoot might allow for better use of that elastic energy compared to a heavy heel strike, which can have more of a braking effect.
But it's not a simple heel strike bad, forefoot good kind of thing.
No, definitely not. He stresses that foot strike is complex and influenced by speed, individual structure, and years of habit. What's most efficient for you, given your body and how you've adapted through training, might be your optimal way, even if it doesn't look like someone else's.
Okay, got it. Let's switch gears to fuel. Where does the energy for all this muscle action and springing actually come from? Martin and Coe outline the energy systems.
Yeah.
There's the immediate stuff first.
Yep, ATP and creatine phosphate. That's your instant power, like for a quick sprint start. But it lasts, maybe 10 seconds max.
Then what kicks in?
Glycolysis. This mainly burns carbohydrates, and it can do it without oxygen, so it's anaerobic. It's faster than aerobic energy production, but way less efficient.
Yeah.
And it produces those hydrogen ions.
Ah, the infamous lactic acid burn. Those more the hydrogen ions, right?
Technically, yeah. The buildup contributes to that fatigue and forces you to slow down. It's self-limiting.
So for distance running, the main player has to be.
Aerobic metabolism, absolutely. This is the big engine. It uses oxygen to break down fuels, primarily carbs and fats, and produces a massive amount of ATP energy. It powers anything longer than a couple of minutes.
And the carb versus fat thing. Fats store more energy, but carbs seem crucial when you run hard.
That's the trade-off. Fats are super energy dense, but metabolizing them requires more oxygen compared to carbs. So as you increase intensity and oxygen delivery becomes a limiting factor, your body shifts towards relying more heavily on carbohydrates because you get more energy yield per liter of oxygen consumed.
So it's not like flipping a switch between systems. They're always working in concert.
Always. Martin and Co. illustrate this really well. Even at the start of a run or during surges, when oxygen demand spikes, the anaerobic systems contribute significantly. Then aerobic takes over for the steady parts. Push hard again, anaerobic ramps up. It's a constant dynamic balance.
And fatigue. It's not just about running out of gas, is it? Magnus talks about the brain being like a central governor.
Yeah, an integrated model. The brain is constantly getting feedback signals from all over the body, core temperature, oxygen levels reaching the brain, muscle glycogen stores, those hydrogen ions, muscle damage signals, loads of stuff.
And it uses that information to, protect you?
Essentially, yes. It acts as a safety mechanism. It starts to dial back muscle recruitment and make you feel tired before you reach a point of catastrophic failure or serious tissue damage. That's why you often feel the urge to slow down before your legs completely give out.
Fascinating. Okay, let's talk about VO2 max. Maximal oxygen uptake, often seen as the gold standard for endurance potential. Training improves it.
Oh, yeah, significantly. Especially for people starting out, you can see big jumps, like 30, 50%. It represents the maximum amount of oxygen your body can take in and utilize during intense exercise.
But it's not the only thing that matters, right?
Yeah.
Magnus seems quite critical of focusing solely on it.
Definitely. He makes the point that VO2 max is really a summary metric. It reflects your heart's pumping capacity, your blood's oxygen carrying ability, your muscles' ability to extract and use that oxygen. The bottleneck can be different for different people.
And for runners who are already well trained, it often doesn't improve much more, even if their performance does.
Exactly. Their VO2 max might plateau, but they can still get faster by improving efficiency, lactate threshold, fatigue resistance, things VO2 max alone doesn't capture. So building a whole training philosophy just around improving VO2 max is probably missing the bigger picture for experienced athletes.
Okay. Another big term, lactate, or lactate threshold. Is it just a waste product? A marker of pain?
Not really, no. Magnus views lactate more as an important fuel source and a key signaling molecule. Its level in the blood reflects that dynamic balance between how much your anaerobic systems are contributing versus how quickly your aerobic system can clear and utilize it.
So training helps you clear it faster.
And tolerate higher levels and use it as fuel, yes. That's where the thresholds come in. Martin and Co. talk about these points where lactate starts to rise.
Like a first threshold, then a second one where it really shoots up.
Right. The first threshold is often where lactate just starts to increase noticeably above baseline, indicating the aerobic system is starting to get stressed. The second threshold, people call it LT, OBLA, lactate turn point. That's where lactate accumulation starts to accelerate rapidly. You're relying much more heavily on anaerobic metabolism, and that intensity is much harder to sustain.
And this is a really important point from the sources. Using a fixed number, like 4 millimoles per liter, to define that second threshold for everyone, that's a bad idea.
Hugely problematic. Martin and Co. explicitly warn against it. Why? Because that actual threshold level varies massively between individuals. It could be 2 millimole for one person, 7 millimole for another. If you base your training zones on an arbitrary average like 4, you might be training way too hard or way too easy for the intended effect. It really hammers home the need for individual assessment.
Wow, okay. One last engine point. Even breathing takes energy.
It does. Especially at high intensities for really fit athletes, the work of breathing can consume up to 15 or 16% of their total oxygen uptake. It's a significant metabolic cost.
Okay, so we've got the engine mapped out. Now, how have people thought about training this engine over the years? Let's talk philosophies and thinkers.
Yeah, the approaches have definitely evolved. Martin and Co. mentioned some pioneers, like Waldemar Gerschler back in the 40s, who used heart rate recovery, waiting for the pulse to drop to around 120 BPM to decide how long the rest should be between short, fast intervals.
An early attempt at structured intensity control.
Exactly. Then Mihaly Igloi in the 50s, his system was quite unique. Lots of sets of short, fast reps with very minimal rest within the set, but then longer recovery between the sets.
What was the goal there?
Really hitting those fast twitch fibers, building speed endurance. It was apparently very demanding, but produced great results for some.
Then you have Arthur Lydiard in the 60s, who kind of flipped the script.
He really emphasized building a huge aerobic foundation first. Miles and miles of steady running to build endurance capacity, then sharpening with faster work later, plus hills and overall conditioning. His influence is still massive today.
So there's been this historical swing between focusing on speed versus endurance first.
Yeah, Martin Coe point that out. The pendulum swings.
Okay, bringing us more up to date. The Norwegian method, as Culp describes it, often linked with polarized training.
Right. The idea is spending most training time at very low intensity, a smaller chunk at very high intensity, and deliberately minimizing time spent in that moderate threshold zone. Though, as we'll see, they definitely do threshold work too.
And it's more than just workout structure. Seeler calls it a biopsychosocial program.
Yeah, it emphasizes collaboration, athletes, coaches, scientists working together, constantly learning and adapting. It's a whole system approach.
A signature element seems to be this double threshold training, doing threshold work twice in one day.
Yeah, that's caught a lot of attention. It's usually something like threshold intervals in the morning and then another session of threshold intervals or tempo in the afternoon. It requires a really significant aerobic base to handle that kind of load.
And they use lactate monitoring quite a bit with this.
They do, but maybe not always in the super rigid way people think. Colt mentions how Marius Bakken used it very precisely to dial in paces, but others like Olav Ingebrigtsen might use it more as a gauge checking trends, seeing how the athlete is responding, adjusting the plan based on that feedback, rather than strictly hitting exact numbers every single session.
So still very individualized.
Extremely. Trial and error plays a big role. They also heavily utilize things like altitude training and heat adaptation, again, tailored very specifically to the individual athlete's response.
Culp suggests the modern version, with athletes like Jacob Ingebrigtsen or Christian Blumenfeld, might be layering concepts from coaches like Canova, these special blocks of very focused work, or Peter Coe's top-up weeks onto that polarized foundation.
It's an evolving synthesis, taking the best bits from different approaches.
Now, Steve Magnus offers less of a specific method and more of a framework, right?
Yeah.
His athlete-centered model.
Exactly. It's not a recipe, it's a coaching philosophy, a decision-making process, 5 steps. Identify the athlete and the event demands. Know the science of adaptation. Decide on the training direction. Design the specific workouts. And crucially, adjust based on how that individual responds.
That adjustment piece seems key, linking back to the lactate variability and everything.
Absolutely. Magnus hammers this point home. You build the system around the runner, you don't force the runner into a pre-existing system. Research shows huge individual variation in how people adapt to the same training stimulus. Generic plans, based on averages, miss this entirely.
He also talks about training being about creating the right balance of different systems, aerobic versus anaerobic, strength versus endurance.
Right. Not just maximizing one thing, but finding the optimal blend for that specific athlete and their event goal.
And challenging the idea of rigid training zones, seeing intensity as more of a spectrum.
Yeah, he argues that training at any intensity influences your abilities at other intensities. It's all interconnected. Progression should happen within zones too, not just by jumping from one zone to the next.
Okay, so we have the body's systems, and we have these guiding philosophies. How do you structure all this over a season or a year? That's periodization.
Right. Periodization is just planned variation. Organizing training into logical blocks or phases, each with a specific focus, building towards a peak performance. Magnus lays out the hierarchy, from the big multi-year Olympic cycle down to the macro cycle, a season or a year, mesocycle, a few weeks, microcycle, a week, and the individual workout.
The general flow is usually from general fitness to race-specific fitness.
That's the classic model. Martin and Coe show this progression. You start with the foundation phase.
Building the aerobic base like Lydiard preached, recovering from last season.
Exactly. Getting the body strong and resilient. But Magnus adds an important point here, especially for longer distances like 10K. Even in this base phase, doing some general speed work like short hill sprints is really valuable.
Why add speed when you're focusing on endurance? Seems counterintuitive.
It's about maintaining neural pathways for speed. recruiting a wider range of muscle fibers, improving force production, and even potentially preventing injuries by making the tissues more robust. It keeps those faster qualities ticking over so they're easier to build upon later.
Gotcha. So after the foundation.
You move into introduction to faster work, where you start layering in more intensity, then consolidation, where you're really solidifying the fitness gains from that harder work.
Then things get really specific.
Yeah, the event fine-tuning phase, workouts become very closely matched to the demands and pace of your goal race. And finally, the tapering off phase, where you cut back training volume dramatically to shed fatigue and arrive at the start line feeling fresh and sharp.
Magnus also describes a pre-competition phase as that bridge where you shift from building fitness components to assembling them for racing. Maybe less general endurance, more focus on hitting specific paces.
And Martin and Co. emphasize the shift in the competition phase itself. It's not just about training load anymore. It's about building confidence, mental readiness, practicing race strategy, understanding competitors. Tapering is key here, too.
Okay, let's get into the nuts and bolts, the actual workouts, the tools of the trade within these phases. Intensity is obviously critical. Martin and Co. talk about anaerobic conditioning. What does that look like?
This is typically training around that lactate threshold pace we discussed, maybe 75–90% of VO2 max pace. It's comfortably hard, sustainable for maybe 15–20 minutes in a block. The adaptations are things like increasing the size of the heart's chambers, making your heart more efficient. An example workout might be 20 minutes at tempo pace, some recovery, then another 15 minutes at a slightly faster tempo.
And then there's anaerobic capacity work.
Sounds tougher.
Oh yeah, much tougher. There's high-intensity interval training, short reps, maybe 200 meters up to 800 meters, run very fast, well above threshold pace, with substantial recovery between reps.
What's the goal here? To really push the limits of the anaerobic system, boost glycolytic enzymes, activate more fast-twitch fibers, and improve the body's ability to buffer acidity. Martin and Co. note this kind of work is key for actually lifting your VO2 max ceiling, focusing on intensity over volume for that specific goal. An example might be sets of fast 200s and 400s with specific paces and long recoveries. Maintaining good form despite fatigue is critical here.
And weaving into this, the Norwegians use that double threshold training we mentioned.
Right, hitting that threshold intensity twice in a day. A very potent stimulus, but needs that big aerobic foundation to absorb it.
Magnus also brings up supermaximal training, going faster than VO2 max pace.
Yeah, he suggests it might offer benefits by stimulating different neural or anaerobic factors, possibly improving running economy or lactate threshold in ways that slower work doesn't. Fewer studies specifically on runners, but it's an area of interest.
Beyond these specific intensities, Magnus categorizes workouts, basic distance runs.
For building general endurance, adapting fuel use, getting the musculoskeletal system used to the load.
The long run, that's almost sacred for distance runners.
Absolutely. Key goals. General endurance boost, encouraging that shift towards using more fat for fuel, increasing glycogen storage capacity, and just toughening up the legs and connective tissues.
And he notes it might be different for slow twitch versus fast twitch dominant runners.
Yeah, runners who are naturally more slow twitch might handle longer, faster long runs better, maybe even adding workouts within them. Fast twitch types might need to be more careful not to overdo the duration or speed, as it could potentially blunt their anaerobic abilities. He also mentions the idea of doing some runs fasted to enhance fat adaptation.
Then you have intervals of all sorts and tempo runs, which are essentially those threshold runs.
And how you progress these workouts is important too. Magnus talks about two main ways. Either starting slower and gradually getting faster across a training block, building aerobic support first, then specific endurance, then speed, or maybe starting with more general work at both ends of the spectrum, like strength and pure speed, and moving towards race specificity in the middle. The second approach focuses on recruiting the fibers first, then building their endurance.
Hills seem like a classic training tool.
Definitely. Magnus points out they alter the stress because you recruit muscles slightly differently. The gradient matters. Gentler slopes might emphasize speed. Steeper slopes emphasize strength. Longer hills build strength endurance. Shorter, faster hills work on power and speed endurance. And he repeats that point about short, fast hill sprints being great in the base phase.
Martin and Co. also talk about multi-pace training,
Which just means incorporating paces both faster and slower than your specific race pace into your training week. Middle distance runners might see their faster sessions get progressively shorter and quicker as they near competition, while long distance runners use multi-pace work too, but perhaps structured differently.
And it's not all just running, is it? Strength and conditioning.
Crucial. And Martin and Co. stress it's about total body conditioning, not just building big muscles. Strength work improves force production, helps stabilize joints, reduces fatigue, and is vital for absorbing the impact forces of running. Injuries often happen where muscles and tendons meet.
Magnus adds the concept of rate of force development, RFD. Why is that important for distance runners?
Because when you're running, especially at race pace, your foot is only on the ground for a tiny fraction of a second, maybe 0.13 to 0.17 seconds. So it's not just about how much force you can produce, but how quickly you can produce it in that short window. That's RFD.
So the strength training needs to reflect that, not just slow, heavy lifts.
Ideally, yes. While basic strength is foundational, incorporating exercises that demand rapid force production can be beneficial. Martin and Co. also emphasize targeting synergistic and stabilizing muscles, not just the big prime movers. Think hamstrings, hip stabilizers. Methods can include bodyweight exercises, free weights, machines, and plyometrics bounding, jumping which directly train that elastic SSC component.
What about core work? Planks.
Magnus suggests that while things like planks have value for basic maintenance, functional full-body movements or circuits might be more effective for training core stability as it relates to running, because your core is constantly working dynamically while you run.
Flexibility gets mentioned too. Dynamic stretching seems preferred.
Yeah, Magnus mentions dynamic stretching. Martin and Co. show specific static stretches for areas like hamstrings and hip flexors, which are commonly tight in runners. The exact role and timing of stretching is still debated, but some level of mobility is important.
We also need to consider the environment. Altitude training.
A classic method. Martin and Co. discuss how the body acclimatizes over time, primarily by increasing red blood cell concentration to carry more oxygen. Takes about 4 weeks at altitude for optimal effect. But then you need to readapt to faster running when you come back down. And as Culp notes with the Norwegians, individual response varies a lot.
And heat adaptation. Culp mentioned the Norwegians using that specifically for Tokyo.
Yeah, deliberately training in hot conditions to trigger adaptations like increased plasma volume and more efficient sweating. Again, highly individual how someone tolerates and accepts to heat stress.
Okay, we've covered training, stimuli, structure, philosophies. But maybe the most important piece is recovery.
Absolutely fundamental. Martin and Co. call it regenerative rest. It's not just time off. It's the period where the body actually repairs and rebuilds itself stronger in response to the training stress. Adaptation happens during rest.
So nutrition, fluids, sleep,
Yeah,
all critical.
absolutely. Sleep is probably the most powerful recovery tool we have, but also managing life stress. Maybe using modalities like massage or baths if they help you feel better. Magnus echoes this constantly. Training provides the stimulus. Recovery allows the adaptation. No recovery, no improvement.
And if you get that balance wrong, too much training, not enough recovery.
That leads to overtraining, as Martin and Co. define it. It's not just being tired from one hard workout. It's a deeper fatigue that doesn't go away with normal rest, often with other symptoms like performance decline, mood changes, maybe illness.
It comes from pushing too hard for too long without letting the body catch up.
Exactly. It can easily lead to burnout, staleness, or injury. The sources stress the importance of learning your individual tolerance through experience and proactively planning recovery into your schedule, not just hoping it happens. Listen to your body proceed to the next hard session only when you feel mentally and physically ready.
Okay, let's try and tie all these threads together. It's clearly complex and very individual. Can testing help guide this process? Martin and Co. mentioned lab tests.
Yeah, things like graded exercise tests, GXT, to measure VO2 max and get an idea of threshold zones, body composition tests, maybe blood work, checking for potential injury risks.
So testing can pinpoint potential strengths or weaknesses. Is your engine limited by oxygen delivery or maybe fuel use?
Potentially, yes. It can provide objective data to help tailor the training plan and monitor how you're adapting. But, and this is crucial, remember that lactate threshold point, the numbers are individual. Testing gives data, but it needs interpretation within the context of that athlete. It's a guide, not a rigid prescription.
The ultimate goal isn't just fitness numbers, it's
Sport excellence, as Martin and Co. put it. Performing well when it counts while staying healthy and motivated. It's that constant dance between breaking down tissues during work, catabolism, and building them back stronger during recovery, anabolism.
and Magnus's athlete-centered model feels like the perfect summary of how to manage that dance.
I think so. Understand the individual athlete, understand the event, apply the scientific principles we've discussed, design the training, and then the most important part, observe the response and adjust, adjust, adjust. It's all geared towards building that specific endurance needed for the race, built on a stable, robust foundation.
And race day itself brings in another layer: tactics, mental game.
Right. Physical readiness is just one piece. You also need mental sharpness, efficient execution, tactical awareness, knowing when to push, when to conserve, and being both a racer who competes and a pacer who can challenge the clock.
Wow. Okay, we've covered a huge amount of ground there, from, the microscopic level of actin and myosin right up to planning an entire Olympic cycle and race strategy.
It really underscores that effective training isn't simple. It's this intricate mix of physiology, psychology, careful planning, consistent execution, and that all-important recovery piece.
And the big takeaway seems to be just how personal it all is. There's no single magic bullet, no one-size-fits-all training zone or plan. What works best is deeply individual and requires ongoing learning and tweaking.
That blend of science and art really comes through in the sources. Understanding the principles, but applying them creatively and flexibly to the individual in front of you or to yourself.
So having gone through all this, what really stands out to you? How does digging into the science of adaptation or the different training philosophies maybe change how you think about structuring training?
That's a great question. For me, it reinforces just how critical that individual response is. Seeing the hard data on lactate threshold variability or Magnus emphasizing the wide range of adaptation, it makes you question any rigid formulaic approach.
Yeah, definitely. Which leads to maybe the final thought for everyone listening. Given everything we've talked about, the individual responses, the limitations of generic zones, the need for constant adjustment, how can you really know if your current training, the intensities you're hitting, the way you're progressing, is actually optimal for your unique physiology? Beyond just looking at race times, how do you assess that fit in real time? What new questions does that raise about how you approach your own running journey?